Welcome along, everybody, to another episode of Monday Night Live. My name is Brendan Malone. For those who are tuning in for the first time, how's your first day of school holidays going? I imagine there's a lot of parents out there right now who are thinking, are we back in lockdown? It's a pretty intense day, that first day of school holidays. I imagine a lot of the teachers out there are quite happy about this, celebrating another little break. Tonight, we've got a pretty special guest on the show. Caralise, who's an author and a journalist. But before we get into that conversation, very important conversation about the End of Life Choice Act, just a couple of administrative matters to deal with. If you're not already a fan of the show on the YouTube channel that we've set up, please get along there and give the YouTube channel a subscribe. Why should you do that? Well, because the show is uploaded there every Tuesday morning, and so you can access it from there the day after and share it with friends. Secondly, once we've got all the technical kinks ironed out, we will be live streaming to both YouTube and Facebook. At the moment, you're watching us streamed on Facebook only. You can go straight to the YouTube channel by going to Monday Night Live Show. That's mondaynightLiveShow.com. So enter that into your URL in the top of your browser there. That's the URL that will take you straight to the YouTube channel. Hit subscribe, turn on the notifications. And if you're not already a fan of the Facebook page, don't forget to click like on the Facebook page as well. Lastly but not leastly, this independent little media, new media venture, Monday Night Live, relies on your support. And you can support the work that we're doing here at Left Foot Media for as little as $1 a month. It doesn't get any easier than that. And you can do that at patreon.com. So that's patreon.com/leftfootmedia. That's patreon.com/leftfootmedia. Now that we've got all the administrative stuff out of the way, let me bring in our guest for the evening. So without any further ado, welcome along, Caralise. Great to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No worries at all. Let me give you a proper intro, because we should do that for all of our guests. Caralise is a Kiwi mother of two who has spent 10 years working as a journalist, breaking national headlines on the front lines with Fairfax Media. She has also worked as a communications assistant and freelance writer, and she is the author of the brand new book, The Final Choice. It's about her journey as a Kiwi journalist on the hunt for the truth about assisted dying and the End of Life Choice Act. Caralise, thank you for taking the time to speak to us tonight about this issue. Can I jump straight in and ask you the most, I guess, important question of all? What motivated you to write this book? Because obviously you're a first-time author, and this is a topic that's huge. And you're a journalist, so you could have, you could have done a podcast series, you could have written articles, you could have produced op-eds, you could have even made a documentary film, I suppose. But you wrote a book. Seems to me quite a challenging thing. What motivated you to write the book?
Sure. Firstly, I've discovered a book really lends itself to this topic. I probably didn't really realize that when I launched into this myself, but what a great way to communicate, to educate, to engage in this issue. You can read it, you can have your cup of tea, and you can just reflect on some of the stories that are included. But for me personally, I guess the journey started back late last year. I went to a freelance job. It was a meeting I attended, and there assisted dying came up as part of a conversation. And I came away from that realizing, wow, this is a big deal, and I knew very little about it. And I sat down with a friend through that process and said, oh, this is what I'm discovering. Look at all this information and all these people engaged in this conversation. And they said, this sounds like a really good book. And again, like you mentioned, I've never written a book before, but I thought it does sound like a book. So I really wanted to use that journalistic skill, the approach to, the journalistic approach to this discussion, looking at both sides of the argument, looking at the actual question we're trying to solve here, and listening to experts in their field and their commentary on it. So that's how I kind of got in there.
Tell me, it's a fascinating book. really engaging. I try and read a book a month, and so I'd like to think that, I know when I'm reading something that's gripping and when it's something that perhaps takes a little bit longer. I find most books tend to take a few chapters to get into. This one was straight away. I didn't have any issues with diving straight into this. The pacing was great. That really moves quite quickly. And just as your sort of one of your interview subjects might raise an important question, you then go off and seek out someone else for clarification. So there's a real great flow to this book. Was that deliberate, or was that your journalistic training that sort of caused you to write it in that way, or did it just sort of come naturally?
Yeah, thanks for the compliment. But really, it was probably a bit of everything. I think when I was looking at putting this together, and as I started writing out the interviews that I was doing, I thought, well, firstly, we're talking about a topic that's very sensitive, so I want to be respectful in the tone. I also want to I want to engage people, because I think you can lose interest if it's too heavy. I felt some people that were involved were very heavy, and what they said was very serious. And I didn't want to sort of disqualify that, but I wanted to allow the reader to have that intensity, but also have the breaks between. So I did work quite hard at the pace. In terms of the structure, it started coming together as I was processing through, and you'd notice if you read through it as well, there's some personal accounts, so personal stories of people that they're facing hardship, they're facing pain, they're facing suffering, and I wanted their personal stories. I also wanted the reader to be able to come on a journey with me, and so it was a bit of a funny combination doing that journalistic hard news approach, but at the same time describing what it was like to sit and listen to the tone of the person I was interviewing, what they were wearing, what it was like in that atmosphere. So yeah, I worked quite hard to get that balance right, but I'm pretty happy with the result.
It's a great book. Of all the people you interviewed for this book, who do you think impacted you the most? Are there people that stay with you?
Oh, well, so many. Pretty much everyone that I did interview, just I think for different reasons. I think I broke the book into sections. So in some of it I look at the medical field and medical experts. I just really appreciate what doctors, palliative care specialists, what they bring to their job every day, what they face every day, the work that they do. It just reminded me as how incredible the people we have among us that are doing these things on a daily basis. And then the legal experts, what they have to grapple with through their job and through their line of work is really, I honour that as well. It's a pretty incredible and challenging job. And then I guess for me, the personal accounts, those personal stories. So one of them was Vickie Walsh. So Vickie, she was diagnosed with brain cancer in her 40s. That was the same sort of time period that Lucretia Seals, many would be aware of Lucretia, they had the same brain cancer. So just the contrast of their stories was quite profound. But Vickie actually, she was given a diagnosis of 12 to 18 months, but that was 8 years ago. And so her story is that of wrong prognosis or just absolute transformation of her body recovering. But Vickie is still fighting cancer today. So stories like that, they just compel you. They make you realise what incredible people are involved in this conversation.
I suppose too that her story, which really reading it was quite a powerful one to really open the book with, was you're really struck too by the fact that this is a lot more complex, this issue. We talk about the idea of people having 6 months or less to live, but here's someone who receives that kind of a diagnosis, but years and years later is still living life and living a very meaningful and full life with her family as well, right?
Yeah, and I think these stories, it shows these stories, a lot of people come to this conversation with personal stories, either ones that very close loved ones have suffered and have gone through certain, difficult dying processes, and then others that, have loved relatives that have as well. And I think what it does is it brings to life some of these theories and principles that we talk about when we're discussing the law. But as well, I think at times it complicates what we're trying to deal with. So it's beneficial, it's alive, it's real, it's reality, and then at the same time it illustrates how complex this really is.
One thing that really stuck out for me was the way in which you talk about this in the book. Death is not something we really contend with or grapple with a lot in everyday life in New Zealand. It reminded me of my own father's death just a couple of years ago, and we had a wake for him, and it was there was an afternoon event where the family was gathered. The casket was open at my sister's place. We had a barbecue lunch. The kids were in the pool. We could each have time one-on-one with Dad. We raised a whiskey glass over the casket to him. And the kids drew colourings and put them in the coffin and all sorts of stuff like that. But that's not a common thing, I've realised since, that it's not something we grapple with. And even in the book, you get that sense of how even within the medical profession, which I was kind of surprised by, it's not something that necessarily they are trained in as a matter of course either.
Yeah, you're right. That was something that very much stood out for me when I interviewed Professor Rod McLeod. So he's a palliative care specialist. And he talked about, or part of what he talked about is that exact thing, that doctors going through their training in medical school, they get sort of, I think it's between 3 and 4 weeks possibly to talk and to learn about the beginning of life. So, conception, babies, birth, they get a good chunk. But when it comes to death, they get 4 hours on one day. And we're talking, Rod was saying that the average doctor that would come out of medicine and go to a GP and be a GP would deal with 40 families that had deaths, the 40 patients dying in their first year. And so I think for me that really highlighted we have an expectation of our medical practitioners to be really up with the play on a whole lot of issues. Even when we're talking about suffering, we're not just talking about physical pain, but the emotional, all parts of suffering. And we put a lot of weight on a doctor to help us through that process. And yeah, there's some pretty big gaps.
Tell me, was there one thing that you discovered or that sort of sticks out to you about this process of investigation that perhaps concerned you or surprised you at all about the act, the issue itself?
Yeah, so many. A book full.
Yeah, that's right.
But I guess for me, right from the get-go, something that really concerned me, and it still concerns me now, is how I think we as Kiwis approach this topic and this specific referendum that we're going to. I've since discovered, and hearing the conversations and seeing people interact through the media and social media, that there's so much misinformation and misunderstanding, and there's so much that gets triggered in this conversation. I think, the more I read into it, there's a lot of experiences, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of lack of information and a lot of misinformation involved in the dialogue that's going around. And it is so hard to sit there when you've heard and you understand the experts and really I guess I could say the truth. If you know those things, to sit back and go, oh well. But so that's really what I'm attempting to do is say, hey guys, I was you, I know what it's like, but hey, you got to get some of this information. You've got to read, you've got to understand what we're actually facing in front of us. So motivational speech.
Tell me, speaking of, because there's some strong arguments being made on both sides, some strong characters presenting those arguments, and you get the sense of that too in the book. What do you think, just starting with perhaps the pro-euthanasia side of the argument, what would you say is possibly one of their more compelling points that you think that they make in this debate?
Well, yes, I think there's a couple, there's a lot, but it's that suffering. It's seeing someone that wants to just go, and it's seeing someone at the end of life that's lived a good life, possibly, but they're in pain, they're tired, they've had enough, and they want to go. And just that whole thought about, how can you deny that? How can you how can you say no when they're in, such a difficult situation? So there's that, and then probably, if I can give you two, the other one is just that it's my life, it's my choice mantra that was a reoccurring thing, and we're probably all familiar with it in a variety of debates. But in terms of this very one, it's very active in the way people think about this.
What about those who were on the opposition side, they're opposed to the bill? What did you find compelling about their case?
I guess if I was going to say in two words, really, collateral damage.
Yeah.
The impact and implication of this law. I thought initially going in, you really hear that message, it's just my choice. If I want to do it, what's wrong with me having the freedom to do that? And but hearing a whole range of perspectives of basically these are some reasons that this is dangerous, or these are some reasons where it's not actually suiting what we're trying to solve here. And some very compelling personal stories, I think, as well, and the way people, how this would actually be applied into our country on a daily basis.
There's a whole chapter dedicated to interviewing David Seymour, who's the architect of the bill, obviously. I was kind of shocked a little bit by the tone of that interview. Were you surprised by the tone?
So I got to meet David at the end of the End of Life Choice Society meeting.
Yep.
And so, that was a interesting time. I really appreciated that he was willing to step aside and give that interview. I think he was very relaxed. It was a Saturday afternoon. It was a relaxed interview, but I did appreciate his honesty, and I appreciated that he just sort of laid it out as how he saw it. And some of what he said did surprise me. Some of his passion was very apparent. It is an interesting chapter.
I'm not going to spoil it for anyone. You need to read the book.
How much do we tell people?
I was a little bit surprised, I have to say, because you interview a variety of people, pro and opposed, and that was the one interview that really stuck out for me. There's something he said on page 216 of the book I just want to quickly touch on, because I think it seems to be a theme that you touch on in the book as well. He's talking about the Lucretia Seals case. And he said the Lucretia Seals case catalysed it. I mean, having an attractive, articulate woman who had done everything right in her life and had this unfortunate illness and just wanted to choose, that's a pretty compelling reason why to support it. She's reasonable, not crazy, and that helped as well. Now, the first thing I thought when I read that was, I wonder what would have happened if it had been perhaps someone who wasn't perhaps as articulate, whether that might have changed the course of history, But the other thing was, it seemed that this was very much something that the book does touch on, is this idea of viewing the issue solely through the lens of those who are strong, confident, capable, whose risk is very minimal, is missing the much bigger picture here, that this law will apply to everyone in society, including a lot of people who perhaps don't have good advocacy, who are not in that same boat, and therefore will be quite vulnerable. And that's a theme that you come back to in the book, it seems.
Yeah, well, it's actually a theme that just came out of interviews. I was quite surprised. It's a bit complicated, because you do have, I think the law is very much intended for that group of people. Yeah. And there is some research overseas that talks about, especially out of like some of the states in the United States that have legalized an equivalent law which allows assisted suicide. So there is some stats that they annually release reviewing some of the information, and you do kind of get an idea of what sort of grouping of people have access to this, but that information doesn't really paint a full picture. And then you hear a lot of stories. So one of the vulnerable groups that really have engaged in this conversation in New Zealand is the disability sector. And so that just became so clear through interviews that there's a real concern for that. I think those that are for this law would say immediately, well, that's a little unfair because this law rules out being eligible based on a disability, and it's very much true. The criteria is pretty strict. We are talking about a 6-month or less prognosis. But I think what people kept coming back to that I interviewed on this specific area was that well, hey, all it takes is for a person that's disabled to basically just stop treating their bed sores, stop taking their insulin if they're diabetic, and boom, they're now 6 months. It's a shady one. It's difficult, but I think some of the things that really stood out again was, the mental state of people that are going through some pretty traumatic experiences. So every single one of them that I interviewed actually, most of them have talked about when they initially had an injury or became aware of their illness, or it developed or got worse. Each one of them had really gone through a period of trauma, of grief and depression. And they say that they're really concerned that if you're in that state of mind and you make some poor choices, this could potentially enable them to make a choice that wouldn't be healthy or wouldn't be best for them long term, that they're not of sound mind. And so this discussion could just go on, because again, if we come back to the piece of legislation we're looking at, it does have some structure around, you have 2 doctors that assess your competency. But if you take that, this is why it's quite intricate, but if you take that statement to a lawyer and say, what does that mean? They would say it doesn't actually sift out mental illness. Competency is more being aware of the implications of the choice that you're making. I don't think any doctor is going to intentionally try and, knock someone off or make someone eligible, or they wouldn't allow someone to go through this if they were depressed. But if you talk to a doctor, depression is extremely difficult to detect, especially on a short meeting, and there's scales of depression. It's a complicated thing. It's not something that I would like to be involved in myself trying to figure out.
Speaking of navigating those complexities, one of the key claims that we heard constantly throughout the campaigning from David Seymour was there's no risk or no harms overseas. It's all being that's been blown out of proportion. You dedicate a good solid chapter really to actually investigating that question, and there's some pretty I would say pretty epic investigative work that goes into that. Was there anything about those overseas data that perhaps shocked you or surprised you?
Oh yeah, so much. Yeah. I think we've just talked about depression. I don't even know where to begin. So some of the information out of the States, there's a stat that said that 1 in 6 people that have used assisted suicide in Oregon were actually clinically depressed, even though that's not allowed. They shouldn't have access to this. Yep. So there was some interesting things once you dig down. I did have help in those chapters. I interviewed a researcher that's been at this for 10 years and also a professor that's over in the Netherlands. So he sat on a review committee over there. That's something that we've taken that template or that concept and applied it to our law here. So we'll have a review body that basically assesses the applications that come in to ensure that they've followed the application process correctly. Really amazing people that are involved in this. Again, so much, but even off the get-go, we look at there's 13 jurisdictions to date that have legalised a form of assisted dying, and we hear about those ones quite a lot, but we also don't hear about the fact that there's been 30 nations that have rejected it, or 30 jurisdictions that have said we don't want this. So immediately coming out the gate, David Seymour says, look, no other nation in this world has actually changed their law. It's been pretty stable, but you have to look at that and go, well, okay, what law has other nations and jurisdictions got, and do they need to shift it? Or a lot of them are quite open in their eligibility compared to us. There's another comment that gets made quite frequently that there's been no rules broken. No people have broken this internationally. Well, even that, you go to the Netherlands and look at their annual reports in 2017, they've had 11 cases where doctors have breached the law, but they just haven't prosecuted them.
Wow.
And you think, oh, hang on a minute, really? And yeah, without saying too much, there's just a lot. There's a lot of stories. There's a lot of good stories of people that, you hear their story and they were suffering and their family felt relieved to release them to death, and stories of people that have chosen assisted suicide or euthanasia because of something like a sex change operation went wrong. So, again, we have to sift and filter through this and look at what, as much as possible, what's relevant. And it was hard work, what's relevant to our law and why, and what can we learn from each thing and each nation and jurisdiction, and how do we assess our law, how does it stack up? So there's a lot, but it's actually really interesting.
Well, the way you put it all together too, it's the cases are very clear. You lay out what happened. There's not much space. You don't add personal conjecture into it. You just say these are the facts of the case, and there's quite a bit of data in that chapter that's, I think, quite important to this issue.
Yeah, it's just understanding where the other nations that are in on this, that have legalised it, where it came from, how did it operate, how it works in their countries, what impact has it had on the medical industries there, how is the law going, who's using it, and why. So I guess those are some of the questions that I came into that part of the research with.
Tell me, what's your, and this might be, I don't know, too hard to answer, but what's your read? You've been over this issue for many months now. What do you think that Kiwis are ready for a referendum on this act?
Yeah, so well, today, over the weekend, we saw a poll come out from Commonwealth Brunton showing that, 63% of Kiwis. The question was, do you think euthanasia should be legal in New Zealand? And so I think around 63% said yes. Yeah. And the thing that just worries me about that, just completely off the get-go, is that we're not talking about euthanasia as a principle when it comes to binding referendum. We're talking about the End of Life Choice Act. And I don't know who commissioned that poll, but it just reinforces all over again the frustration of misinformation that's surrounding this debate. So we need to understand that this is an act that has been voted through Parliament. It's gone through the political process. And it's got to that point before it could pass that third reading. They had to, David Seymour and those in favour had to negotiate with a couple of the political parties so that it could get a majority and actually vote through. So one of those manoeuvres that was done, even though this was a conscience vote, one of the manoeuvres was done with New Zealand First to basically say, well, they just said, look, we're not voting this through unless it goes to binding referendum. So that was part of the deal that had to be done. So yes, it is binding referendum. It is to the majority of Kiwis. I think there is major concern that we don't know that it's a piece of law we're looking at. We don't know how to analyse law. Like, we're not lawyers. Yeah. And really, wasn't that the politician's job?
Well, that's the challenge. So I was going to ask you as a follow-up question about do people realise, and you've already answered that we're actually voting on an act, not just the question, what do you think in principle about this? And I think that's obviously quite an important factor here. Were there aspects of the act itself that perhaps surprised you in your investigations here?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. Really, the eligibility criteria is a huge thing, and it's something that we have to consider when we even approach this. Why did we put it at 6 months, unless prognosis of 6 months? Why did we put the line there? Why did we rule out those with chronic illness or those with dementia, advanced directives? Why did we put the line here? And will it stay there in future years if it's put there for a good reason? So there's some elements like that. Also, one that stands out is, one of the biggest risks or dangers in this type of law, or one that has been most referred to in my interviews, has been that of coercion. So pressure on family members to choose this form of treatment, and that family or whoever it is putting the pressure. So the law has a safeguard against that, and that safeguard is that there must be 2 doctors that assess the patient, and they will be looking and considering if there is any coercion. The piece of legislation actually says the doctor must do their best to assess that. And so, I took that piece of legislation, put it in front of a Queen's Council member, Grant Illingworth, and said, what does this mean? Will this work? And so his response is in the book.
Well, yeah, well worth reading too. I mean, here's something I discovered, and I thought I knew this issue well, was that I didn't realise that in actual fact, the question about are you even eligible, it was about 10 or 11 questions into the process. So we start the process, and then once we're well into it, then we ask you about eligibility, we investigate eligibility. And I was quite astounded by that. I thought the first question would be, is the person actually eligible before we go any further?
Yeah, and that's where Grant, and that's exactly why we need experts looking at this, because there's no way that I would know what good legislation sounds like, reads like, is applied. But people like Grant and Richard McLeod, who's part of a big group, well, reasonably large group of lawyers for vulnerable Kiwis, vulnerable New Zealanders, they've taken this law and really gone through it and really worked out, okay, is this the best piece of law that we can have? If as a nation we've agreed that we want the concept of assisted dying, is this the best law for it? Will this do the job, and will it protect where it needs to? So even in lawmaking, I learnt, you've got the autonomy, the choice that we're trying to enable people to have the freedom of choice to make good decisions of over their lives. And, we do that for a whole country. And then at the same time, we need to protect vulnerable people. We need to protect people from any dangers of the law that we are either introducing or restricting. So there's such an art. I'm not a lawyer, but I got a really quick, good understanding of the picture and how it operates. And this is just such a case and point of this type. This law is a huge one. Again, bioethicist Margaret Somerville, interviewed in the book. She's living in Australia. She has 9 doctorates, and she was involved in Canada when they legalised it over there. But just what she brought to the conversation around, ethics and ethics for people in medicine, but also to realise that this is one of the most important values decisions that we will make in our generation, in this century. And I thought, oh, she's just kind of exaggerating. But the more I looked at it, I can see what she's meant. And and her chapter 2, and another reason to read this book, it was, again, I discovered things that there's an article from the New York Times from the 1930s about the Nazi euthanasia program that you actually republish in there. I was really quite surprised. I won't spoil it for anyone. You really need to read this book, is what I'm saying, because there's so much important information in there. For you personally, how has the process of writing this book, has it changed or shaped your views in any way? What do you think it's done in that regard for you? Oh, absolutely, on so many levels. So firstly, to recognise what people go through on a daily basis, both in so many areas, the disability sector, what people struggle or live with, and what they push through, and how they bring a good attitude to life, and they live life with far more restrictions. So there were so many personal moments that I had that really struck me. Then as well, just education around the dying process. I learned so much about what dying actually looks like physically, often what happens to your body, to your breathing, to the way you think about things, and learned a lot about palliative care, how we treat people at the end of life. Even things like hospice. Like hospice is only 50% funded by government and 50% fundraiser or donation based, and hospice provides care, stunning care for people, a lot that are at end of life. But why are we not supporting this? We probably all want to use hospice, but yet the funding just isn't adequate. And then just what else did I learn? Oh goodness, it shifted me. I mean, even personally, book writing, discovering how to write a book, how you do it.
Tell me.
There's so much.
Look, you could see that. That's the beauty of this book. is you get the sense, and it's woven through it, of course, is COVID-19, which might sound surprising, but it's woven through this as well. You really get that sense of that you as an author are going on this genuine inquiry, and you get a sense of how you are engaging the whole way through that process, which I think it's why it's so compelling. One of the people you spoke to, Professor David Richmond, retired now but highly qualified New Zealand doctor and professor. One thing that, let me read this because I think this is something that really struck me and I'd never even considered before. He said, one thing, this is you speaking now, but one thing that particularly upsets David about the proposed law is there is no plan to help those who apply for assisted dying and are denied. He's got a point. Internationally, around a third of applicants are turned down because they don't meet the criteria. And this is what David said. If a person applies and gets rejected, there is no attempt to salvage that person. All the legislation says is the person has to be told. There's no follow-up. There's no attempt to throw resources behind the person and help them in the state of mind that they're in. They have nowhere to turn if they get that negative result. And that really hit me when I read that. And it brings home to the fact that when you think about this act, it's not really designed to address those bigger questions. It's about one choice, and it really only has in mind those people, that very small group of competent, capable people who will qualify, and that's about it. It doesn't really provide a lot of care beyond that choice.
Yeah, and that's part of what I discovered as well on this process, and I had to write an epilogue. But, suffering is something that it's very complex. It is far-reaching. It touches so many issues of our lives. I don't want to go down too much of a rabbit trail, but Rod McLeod, the professor who's a palliative care specialist, talked about a patient that he treated that said, I think it was Rod's interview, that she said she was suffering. And Rod asked her, she had a disease that would have a lot of pain, and so he assumed it was pain, but he said, are you in pain? Are you okay? What kind of suffering? And she said, well, my son drifted off to the sea 3 years ago and never came home. And so he was just astounded that suffering is so complex and diverse, and I think so when we approach the End of Life Choice Act, I think a lot of us have hope that this piece of law would solve a whole lot of issues. And I think we just have to be aware that, you know what, even if this gets legalised and it gets a majority, that some of these really difficult cases are going to remain. Yep. And we need to start addressing a wider picture than just the small group that would fit some eligibility criteria. I think what David shared was actually, that too really stood out to me. I think some of us put a hope that if we introduce this law, that the suicide rate would change, or that at least it would sort of lessen, because some people may be feeling like their only option is suicide right now at the end of life. But again, if you go internationally and look at data, that unfortunately just isn't the case. Jurisdictions that have this in place, there's no some have increased, some have decreased. There doesn't seem to be any pattern that's emerging. So, I think there's some really, really difficult issues that we have here that we need to address. But it's sort of like, is this the right way? Is this going to work? How will this interact with that?
Yeah, and that's the huge reality of this. And just a couple of quick ones to finish up related to that point is, we've all got to vote in the referendum. If you're in New Zealand, that's coming up. It's a huge issue. And this book, for me, just really, again, so much information that we need to know about this. What do you think people can do to inform themselves better before they go and cast their vote? Perhaps even inform and help others to be aware too.
Yeah, well, of course, I'll pull out the book.
Yeah, of course.
Shameless plug. I really do believe that we need to listen to experts. So whether that's read a book or approach an expert that you know and start sort of picking their brains for it. Read up on it. I think we need to stop and assess the why. Yep. So no matter what you vote for, you want to know why. What's your motivation? So if you vote for this, why? And listen to that and actually genuinely say, am I afraid of something? Because this is an opportunity to address things. That's what I found as well. There's an opportunity to address some issues here. Let's make the most of it, just like COVID. Let's take this moment in history and say, okay, what are we dealing with here? Are we afraid? What's motivating us? Is there a way we can be compassionate? What about, are there experiences that you've had that were really difficult, you still feel that pain, you still feel the trauma, you still feel that, you hold your breath even, and it still makes you sad. If that's going on, you've got to look like, you might even need to pursue counseling. We carry grief and we carry suffering and observation of suffering with us until we find some freedom. So I guess all of that in saying, yes, please get informed, please do your reading, get a copy of the book, put it, read it and pass it on, get it from your library. But as well, just take that moment to stop and reflect and think, what is this for? And is this going to do the job? Yeah, I guess that's what I would love to see.
I'd say I can't endorse this book strongly enough. As I said, I thought I knew this issue well. I learnt stuff. It's a fascinating read as well. Where do people get the book from, Caralise?
Yeah, so most bookshops should have it in stock, and if they don't, then ask for it. They can very easily get it. Otherwise, you can get it directly from my website, which is www.thefinalchoice.nz.
Okay, so where was that again? Where can people get the book from?
So bookstores, and if they don't have it, then just ask, or my website, www.thefinalchoice.nz.
Now, one last thing too is I noticed that you have made yourself available to speak about this issue. I guess the fact that you've investigated it in such an in-depth way makes that an ideal opportunity for people to grow in their knowledge by having someone like yourself come and speak in their town or their city. How do people get a hold of you if they're interested in having you come to their region to speak about this?
Sure. So I am taking some bookings around the place at the moment. Best way is just get onto that website, and down the bottom, if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you'll see an application form. Very easy to fill in. Just drop me a line, say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. Are you available? And I'll get back to you as soon as I can.
Caralise, that was so awesome, and thank you for taking the time to be with us. Hugely controversial issue, so much to think about. I'm going to say it again. You've got to read this book. It is such a good book, and I congratulate you on writing what is not just an important and informative book, but also an extremely engaging read. I found that I didn't want to put it down. So well done you for, I think, helping the New Zealand voting public in this regard to be better informed about such an important issue.
Thank you, and thank you for your time tonight and your interview. It was great. Thanks,
no
guys.
worries at all. Thanks for coming.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side our fears are done. All the good times just begun. We know what we have, let's hold on tight. Found what we're looking for in life. Call us crazy, but things are finally right. With you and I, the future is bright.